So what is a body? From an embodiment perspective, it's a lot more than the standard view might suggest. I'm going to suggest the body has 12 different functions, 12 aspects. And the first two of these are things that might be familiar. So the first one is just the basics. So we're looking at basic physical health, survival, locomotion. In this series, we're less interested in these. Of course, they're important. Basic physical health, it's a foundation, and the other ones relate to it. But this is more the common sense view of the body. My colleague Francis Breyer sometimes calls it the brain taxi. The next one is beauty. So while society generally doesn't look at this in much depth, the idea is the body being involved in receiving and expressing beauty, I think, is there. And again, this is one that's not so much around this series. So the next 10 really relate to this field of embodiment. The first one is perception. So we don't see the world how it is, we see the world how we are. This is common sense, really. If you're on holiday, you're relaxed, the sun's been shining, and you've embodied that sense of holiday relaxation. Things look pretty different after a few days on holiday than when you first arrive and you've got the sort of body of tension and whatever you've come with from work. So we see the world through the lens of our embodiment. The next aspect of embodiment is how we think. So we think with our whole bodies. Our bodies really affecting how we think. And there's studies now, for example, that shows if you move in certain ways, it will help your creative thinking. And if you move in other ways, it will help, say, your more linear, kind of rational, checking things kind of thinking. So two different modes of thinking that come from two different embodiments. There's another great study where people were put on a Nintendo Wii board where they rocked from side to side. And this better enabled them to see two sides of an argument than when they were just there still. Next function of the body, emotion and motivation. So the emotions have geography, they're housed in the body. This makes sense, really. When you're emotional, you feel it in your body, you have sensations, we have phrases like sort of our gut and our heart and our hands, all these kind of phrases that exist out there. This is really common sense that the emotions are bodily, that motivates us to do certain things. Things are either yum or yuck, connects us to our basic needs and values. There's evidence to show, for example, when people have spinal injuries, how they feel about that, the strength of emotion is related to how much of the body is actually cut off. So if you have an injury higher up, you can't feel a lot of the body. And in those cases, you'd expect people to be very distressed by that. But actually, at first, they're not. There's less of an emotional reaction. So our body guides us through our emotions. These let us know what's important to us, what we like, what we don't like. So a lot of this is pointing to the next area, which is identity. So the body is how we maintain who we are. The set of habits, the set of dispositions that we call our personality, that's embodied. This also relates to the function of learning. We've learned certain ways of being, and not learning in the broadest sense, so not just like a fact, but we've learned in our systems what's safe, how we relate to people, how we interact in the world, our way of being. And that predisposes us to do things in the future or not. So in this way, our embodiment is like a solidification of our sense of self, of who we are, of what we've been through, where we are now, and what that predisposes in the future. What we predispose in the future leads us into the function of creativity, how we create action, how we do things in the world, how we plan, usually through language, we plan and then create whatever it is in the world. Our embodiment leads us through that creation process and leans us in certain directions. Our body is also a source of insight. So we have all this past history, all this implicit learning that is throughout the whole body. So not just in the brain, the nervous system is completely distributed. The body is the brain, as Mandy Blake says. And the body is also the unconscious. So all those things that have happened to us are all laid down there. So when we go to the body, when we have access to the body, we have a huge amount more insight than we would otherwise have. This is the personal insight, and while this one's harder to prove, I think there's also transpersonal insight. We can call this inspiration, a sense of something coming through us, a sense of something bigger than ourselves, which inspires us to create, to do the things we do in the world. Should also mention relating as a function. This idea of the body is how we coordinate with people, it's how we connect with people, how we are with others. We're interbeing, we're not just lone billiard balls knocking around, we're constantly giving in and taking out and being creatures of relationship. and that's very much an embodied sense. When people talk about, being in a group and the vibes being a certain way, that's a very loose way of talking about that embodied connection that's happening between individuals, like the interbody being that we have. The last function would be ethics and values. So what we care about is embodied. There's a felt sense of, yeah, this is right or this is wrong, not as a abstract cognitive moral thing, but simply in the sense that it feels good to take care of people. It feels good to be of service. For our whole beings, our values and ethics are right through every cell in our body. So all these 12 functions, this is what we're going to explore in this series. I've just very brief overview now. If they don't make sense, don't worry, that we'll get into each of them in more detail. This view of the body is pretty radical and leads us to have a set of really useful skills for life, and also quite a different perspective on life, I would say, as well. And as leaders, knowing the body is involved with all these things makes us tremendously more powerful. So the body has a past, it has a present, that's where the body's the access point of the present moment, coming through the past, and also creates our futures. So these views on the body come from various sources. Paul Linden, Richard Strozzi Heckler, many of my teachers have influenced me in expanding that this isn't just a lump of flesh, expanding the view, there's much more to it than that. And that's what embodiment's all about.